Okay, wanted to put this one out here. I think it's a really important topic for us to talk about, and it kind of knocks on to the type of thing we do every spring with ETS Labs and the school to bring some really neat study that we've done over the last year out to everyone. So this is not only for the students, but we're also going to do this as an outreach piece for the industry. So what we did was a mechanical versus hand harvest trial, and then we also compared different processing methods. Then we looked at phenolics, chemistry, and flavor. We have to give a shout out to the sponsors for this project. The Cabernet came from Eritage Vineyard. They were kind enough to donate that to the program. And then ETS Labs for doing all the analysis. They've always been such fabulous partners. Got to make sure that they get a shout out for this. And also Gerry Weber, because he put together the most fabulous pictorial of the 2018 vintage. And we have a resource for years of hundreds and hundreds of wonderful pictures. So thank you, Gerry. So our goal here was to observe and empirically test for the impact of harvest method on a production level wine. Before we begin, I just want to clear up a couple of codes that we might go back and forth on. The ERCS is Eritage Cab Sauv 1. That's the machine-picked trial. ERCS 2 is the destemmed and hand-picked trial. So we ran that one through our Delta E-2 Destemmer and crusher. And then the third is a crusher destemmer. It's from the 1970s, and it's actually Gary Figgins's original destemmer. And I think we need to put it in the museum. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So the machine harvesting we did was with a Pellenc Selectiv 2, and it's a fabulous machine. They not only harvest, but they destem as well in the vineyard. So you get a one-pass process. You get the fruit delivered directly to you, and there's no real further processing required. The fruit's very clean, shockingly so. I would say almost as clean, if not right at as clean as our optical grape sorter gets. So very, very interesting piece of equipment that's really kind of revolutionized the way a lot of people think about mechanical harvesters. So I think it's a really good opportunity to see if in fact it goes with the old perceptions that mechanical harvested fruit isn't as desirable as hand-picked fruit. And I want to talk about the hand picking here. So here's what we have. Here's our hand picking crew, and they're out picking in those same vines. They're picking Cabernet, but there's some things I want to point out about this. The age of the crew, they're not young. We're aging out. This type of harvesting is going to be harder and harder to do as we move forward, especially in the current age that we're entering into. And we have to sort of talk about, what's socially sustainable. And so we're going to see mechanization having to be a bigger and bigger part of viticulture, not only in Washington, but around the world. It's going to be harder and harder to get people to do hand labor, and it's going to get more and more expensive as we do it. So I tend to think that we will be moving towards more mechanization, and that's okay. There's really nothing wrong with that with the technology and the things that we have today. I think there's some real amazing tools that we're getting put out there for viticulturists to use to do a fantastic job, maybe as good as handwork, or in maybe some cases even better. But we'll talk about that as we go through this. So the point of this trial was a few things. Number one, to compare machine harvesting, but then we wanted to throw two more things into the mix. So we got a destemmer crusher. We've got our Delta E-2 Destemmer with crusher rollers in place. I also just put this picture up because it was from the 2018 vintage and made me extremely happy. The team that we had that year, and what a just amazing vintage that was. Really remarkable in so many ways. Really high quality fruit, a really great team to work with. And so just big shout out to Joel Perez, Sabrina Lewick, and Marcus Raffinelli, who all just were so instrumental in taking that vintage on and making these projects happen. And then the good old crusher destemmer. So that has crusher rollers up top. You can see up top that there's some bearings up there, and there's crusher rollers in the top. And then the fruit comes down. And then in modern destemmers, we have a rotating basket and a stator that turns around to whip the stems out. This has a fixed basket. And because of that, it definitely shreds the fruit a little bit more. So it throws a few more jacks and is a little bit more aggressive. But building on some of our previous trials of stem inclusion and the optical sorter trial from 2013 vintage that was published in the June 2014 Wine Business Monthly, I recommend you go look that up. It really led into this. So we have some really nice foundational knowledge that we've built over the years to kind of look at how these things impact wine. So got to give a shout out to the team. These are all the people that made it happen. We got James Dixon, Meg Keltzer, Eva Hickson, Stephanie Siegel, and then Stephen Jackham on the end, which is really weird because he was in every picture, but he was never facing the camera. He's like a ghost. So out of like the 300 pictures, this is about the only one I could find of Stephen. And Stephen also is a challenging one because he's a transfer track student, which means he is working incredibly hard to do all of his chemistry and biology and math to get him to be able to be a transfer track student. So a really hardworking guy. Got to give a shout out to everybody who made this happen. So let's compare and contrast mechanical harvesting versus hand picking. So the conventional wisdom with hand harvesters has always been that it's really, really hard on the fruit. It's not as clean. It beats up the vines, beats things up, and you end up with a lot of stem and matter other than grapes and leaves and things like that. And perhaps that may have been true in the past, but the modern mechanical harvesters are really, really good. So they're vastly lower labor costs. You don't have much of that at all, and they're much faster. A mechanical harvester just flies down the row at a rate that you can't even touch with hand picking. And in addition to that, you're not dealing with that labor issue. So the other piece to that equation, though, on mechanical harvesting is mechanical harvesters are very expensive. They're $250,000. So it's, something you're going to have to think about and just do a cost benefit analysis. But we are going to see in the future it get more and more expensive to hand pick. When I came to Walla Walla in 2010, it was around $120 a ton to hand pick, and now we're getting quotes upwards of $200 a ton. So that gets to be pretty expensive. And the other side that's really cool about mechanical harvesting that's really was surprising to me is the fruit just shows up and it's perfect. It's done. It's sorted. It's finished. You don't have to process it. You just throw some yeast in and go. And that's pretty interesting from a time-saving standpoint. Of course, hand picking is considered gentler. You have better image. You have control of the destemming. So, from the artisanal standpoint, it definitely has that look. But is it socially sustainable? Are we going to have pickers in the future? What's that going to look like? And then my other thing is, what's gentle about a destemmer? I mean, here you are throwing the thing in a destemmer that's ripping the grapes off anyway, and then throwing it in the bin. So I don't see how you get a net benefit of just destemming more gently, unless you're hand destemming each individual berry, which some people do. But I don't see what's terribly gentle about destemming and crushing the fruit anyway. I want to show you the trial just so you can visualize it. We did upright puncheons. These were all fermented in upright puncheons, and each trial we did 700 pounds of cab. We did a little bit of potassium metabisulfite solution, and then a little bit of EC118 and Go Firm to start it. We also did add nitrogen, about 200 milligrams a liter of nitrogen in the form of diammonium phosphate during this fermentations because the ENs are pretty low, which is pretty typical in Washington. That's not an unusual thing. And so the first one we did it in duplicate, machine picked. We did destemmed and then and crushed, and then we did the crusher, then destemmer. And just to show you a visualization of the trial that each one of these was done the same way. What I'm going to show you in the data is the combined data set. The replicates really had pretty similar chemistry and phenolics. So I think instead of getting messy and showing 6 graphs, I'm just going to kind of average them out because the differences are substantial enough that I think you'll see it. So I just wanted to put that out there, put the names out there of the students that did this, give them a shout out. And then also just to compare and contrast the differences in juice chemistry. So what we have here is we have pretty similar numbers down the line. The only thing that's really different that stands out in a big way is the glucose fructose. We got about 14 grams per liter more glucose fructose in the destemmer and the hand-pick trial. And we saw that very similar thing back when we did the sorter trial back in the day. And we think that perhaps there's some raisoning and things that don't get tossed off the vine so easily in the sort of kind of sorting process. And so there may be some raisins and things like that that come through. So we saw that back in 2013, and we've seen that pretty regularly, that the more highly sorted fruit tends to have less sugar. And the machine pick was far cleaner than the destemmed and crushed trial. The fruit looked like it was just a big bowl of blueberries. And then also, these were all aged in exactly the same oak. So these are all Soury American oak barrels too. So that way we wouldn't have any variation in oak. So they're all brand new Soury American oak barrels. I wanted to put this up here because it's kind of funny. And just because there's one here from Meg Keltzer that I thought was absolutely perfect, and everybody needs to see it because Meg is a blast, and I think that's a perfect example right there. But we got through them, and here's all the cap management that was done to them. Post-fermentation, the wines were all pressed separately. Duplicates were blended against those American oak barrels. And then we inoculated for malo with uniform alpha. That way we got through a proper malolactic fermentation. So here are our expectations. The machine harvester basically has a built-in sorter, and the fruit's very clean. The Delta E-2 Destemmer is pretty good at minimizing jacks, but there's going to definitely be more mog than the machine harvester. And then the old crusher destemmer pulverizes the fruit and stems and then throws significant mog in the fermenters. So we're thinking, when we're going into this, that perhaps we would see some results that were similar to our stem trials and sorter trials, which the more stem material you get sort of an increase in phenolic mass across the board. And so we'll see if that played out. So we have to look at fermentation kinetics to see if these fermented differently, because that might point to differences in extract and things like that. So we're going to walk you through those graphs real quick. So this is the treatment one. This is the machine picked, and it completed fermentation in about 11, 12 days. The hand picked, again, pretty similar fermentations. This is the destemmed and crushed trial, very similar. And here we are for the other trial, which is the crusher destemmer. And we see really similar fermentation kinetics across board, similar temperatures. And so that's really good because that helps us see how good of if we wouldn't have any variations between fermentation temperatures to drive any of the changes that we see as we get through this. So observations, pretty even fermentation. As a matter of fact, it's really freaky how similar these were. Normally we see some variations beyond that, but the fact that these completed on almost identical curves was really, really interesting. So let's talk about where things landed. Let's do our chemistry first. And so here's our ethanol, and we see that difference in glucose fructose. That's, I think, driving the biggest changes here. We've got a full % difference in some change between the machine picked, which is on the left, all the way through to the more conventional practices where we're just stemming and crushing the fruit. Definitely higher alcohol contents, and I think that was partially just because of the way the fruit came in, and I think a lot of the raisins stick around. Again, pretty typical. This does build on what we saw in the sorter trial back in the day. Volatile acidity, they're all pretty low, to be honest with you. These numbers are pretty similar, but the highest VA is also in the one with the highest ethanol, and osmotic stress is a driver for volatile acidity. So we'd expect the highest volatile acidity to be on the highest, alcohol wine. So that's true, but again, these are really low numbers. To have a red wine finished with mallow, and these are current numbers, these are 18 months down the road, in barrel with only half a gram a liter of volatile acidity, is really, really low. These are very clean, very well-made wines. So let's talk about titratable acidity. This page is not the greatest because this graph isn't zeroed, so it shows the differences to be much bigger than they are. But the reality is the machine picked has the highest acid, and we tend to see that whenever we have stems come into the equation, we tend to see a little bit more potassium, and we see more precipitation of acid. So the differences aren't as big as the graphs show, but it is a pretty big difference between the destemmer crusher at 5.2 and 5.9 in the machine picked. And again, that idea that more stem inclusion tends to drop acid a little bit. I would have expected treatment 2 and 3, the crusher destemmer and destemmer crusher, to be more similar, but here you go. But here's what I find really, really, really interesting, is that they have almost identical pHs. And I think this really goes to show how potassium influences pH. And this is something that I've been really starting to see a lot. I think we've been starting to see it, and the influence of potassium on flavor. And recently we just realized that we, in all of our chemistry panels, can get potassiums as well. And we've noticed that that is a huge driver for mouthfeel. And higher potassium levels in wine can really give a flavor and salinity to the wine. And they also cause a lot of buffering. So if you have really high levels of potassium, you're going to have very buffered pHs, which means your pHs are going to be very high. These are things like we see down in the Rocks district, where you've got lots of potassium accumulation in the Syrah vines that are getting really hot down in that terroir. And that potassium accumulation eventually precipitates pretty much all the tartaric acid out. And you end up with huge carrying capacity for potassium. And some of that salinity and that mouthfeel that we get from that region is due to potassium. And we see potassiums sometimes up as high as 1,800, 2,000 milligrams a liter in wine, which is really unusual. And so pretty interesting. So let's talk about that potassium number in these wines. And these are a little bit more typical, right around 1,000 milligrams per liter. So there's some potassium there, but the buffering capacity isn't as substantial as one that has maybe 1,800 or 2,000 milligrams a liter of potassium. And so that's really interesting, but I thought it was pretty reflective that we have similar pHs because really similar potassiums. So pretty cool. Okay, phenolics. Let's go ahead and see how these differ from a phenolic perspective. So let's talk about catechin and epicatechin. These are indicators of seed tannin or seed ripeness or seediness of a wine. So we have the highly sorted one that's really cleanly done with the ERCS1, which is the machine picked, and it has the lowest amount of catechin. We have a little bit more stem being thrown from the Delta E-2 Destemmer, and we've got a little bit more catechin. And then at the end one, 3, where we've got that kind of shredding action going on with the stems, we have more. And so we have a little bit more catechin. These numbers are really low. Things like Nebbiolo can have hundreds of milligrams a liter of catechin. So these are really low numbers anyway, but there is definitely an increased trend on these. Then we look at total tannin. And again, this is tracking exactly along with what we've seen in the stem trial in the past. We see a increase in tannin all the way across the boards with the more stems that we get. So there is an increase in phenolic mass. So if you have a site that's really unruly, that has really aggressive phenolic and tannin material, maybe machine picking is actually really good for it. Or with one of these Pellenc harvesters, or perhaps using an optical sorter or something like that, because that'll help mitigate tannin. In the grand scheme of things for Cabernet, these are pretty low tannin wines. I think probably the reason they're not at much higher, the one that we've done with this previously from Eritage, we can get closer to 900 to 1,000 milligrams a liter of tannin. My thinking as to why these are lower was simply because we didn't get particularly hot ferments. They were small in mass. Smaller ferments don't get particularly warm, and that's the big driver of extract. So these are pretty medium bodied in the grand scheme of things, but seeing that the fermentations were all very, very similar, I think we're seeing that effect of stem inclusion, again, driving just general phenolic mass. And there's a lot more tannin in the crusher destemmer. And again, knocking on, similar thing. In our stem trials, we've had kind of mixed results, but in the sorter trial, we've been pretty clear on it that whenever we have a little bit more catechin, it seems that we carry a little bit more anthocyanins. And I think that may have to do with there's some symbiosis between catechin. I've had discussions with Steve Price over this, maybe chime in and clarify things with me. But we've tended to see this, we've seen it a few different times on many trials. When we see a little bit more catechin, we see more anthocyanins. And they're also, at the same time, kind of produced in the same pathway, too. So there could be some variation in viticulture stuff, but I think it might just have to do with a similarity that it just helps the wine have a more of a carrying capacity for more anthocyanins. And then when you have more anthocyanins, you got more potential for polymeric anthocyanins. And polymeric anthocyanins are what are going to give you that plushness, that smoothness, to a wine, and we see that when we have some stem inclusion, we always see an increase in polymeric anthocyanins. And I think that's because these catechin and epicatechin type tannins are phenolics are very, very reactive, and they help to induce that polymerization. So we definitely have more of that across the boards. The more stems, the more polymeric anthocyanins. Again, we see that pretty regularly. And so when we look at how much tannin we have to how much stem we have, and it looks like the most stemmy in the grand scheme of things is the Eritage Cab 2. But again, these are really minuscule numbers. For the amount of tannin we have to have that little catechin, really only a hot climate Cabernet is going to get that way. We'd see vastly different numbers if we were looking at Nebbiolo Pinot Noir. They'd be very different. So not particularly telling a whole lot in this case, but figured we put it up there anyway. And then polymeric anthocyanin tannin index. So this is going to be show us which one's the most kind of plush. And this is pretty normal numbers for Cabernet. Once we get up around, down below like 0.05, that's going to be a really gritty wine because it's not very polymerized. 0.07 is pretty typical Cabernet territory. And then once you get up to close to 0.1, those are the really fat, really smooth wines. And we only see that in things like Syrah and Malbec, really high color wines with moderate tannin where you can really polymerize them. So again, pretty academic in terms of number differences here. They're pretty similar, to be honest with you, very, very similar. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. We have higher starting glue fruit in the handpicked, but they're similar acids, similar pH. We've seen this before. This is not unusual. The machine picked has less matter other than grapes, really close to the optically sorted trial we did back in 2013. All this kind of goes against the conventional wisdom that machine harvesters are bad. So if you have a big tannic, unruly site, you might want to consider looking into using a mechanical harvester. Save you some effort, save you some time, save you some money. So pretty cool. And I really enjoyed doing this. And then I've got to do a big thank you to Eritage for putting this out there for us. Thank you, Justin Wiley, for doing this, and Dana Lammers. You guys are amazing. Also, huge shout out to ETS Labs, Gordon Burns, Marjorie Burns, Rich DeCenzo, Steve Price, Eric Hervé. You've done so much to help our students get such a great understanding of all kinds of things in wine that we'd never be able to do at a regular community college. So the support that we get, just thank you to the Walla Walla wine community. Thanks, everybody. And I hope you learned something. Cheers.